Thank you. Thank you very much. It is perfectly on the dot. May I now invite Puspa?
Sure.
About 7 minutes.
7 minutes, yeah. I think I'll keep my comments within 7 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Rather than playing the role of a discussant of you, I think I would rather compliment to what Mr. Ratna just presented, because as he already told that this was an exercise that we did on a collaborative basis among Southeast members and partner institutions and also a number of other think tanks in the region about how South Asia can go about collectively as a group in the Bali Ministerial. So emphasizing to what Mr. Ratna said, I think I would rather elaborate on some of the points that we had discussed and that we have come out with the resolution that we submitted to the governments of South Asian countries. The first one is on services. There were two issues actually that we have come up on services. One is that currently the plurilateral negotiations that are going on, the services agreement in terms of having an international services agreement by a group called the Really Good Friends of Services, that is something that I think we should oppose, because services is part of the multilateral, is a multilateral issue already. So I don't think it is good that something which is already in the multilateral process is being plurilateralized, because that will be to the detriment of the other like least developed countries mainly in the region. And what I also see is that of the South Asian countries, Pakistan is one of the members of the group of the Really Good Friends of Services. So I think there is a case that if South Asia needs to go together as a group in the WTO, then Pakistan, I think, should withdraw from its membership, as Singapore recently did. Although it was a member earlier, Singapore has withdrawn from this International Services Agreement group. And that is what I think we should request Pakistan, the government of Pakistan also to do. The next issue on services, on the services waiver that the LDCs have been provided from the 8th WTO Ministerial. If you look into the details of the services waiver, I think it's quite limited in scope, and the LDCs don't have much to gain from it, because unless the markets of the developed countries are opened up to those services sectors in which the LDCs really have the interest, then the way the services waiver have come is not going to be beneficial to the LDCs. Therefore, if we are really to benefit out of the services waiver, what we have to do, I think, is one of the most important sectors that we have to focus on and then ask for opening up is Mode 4 by delinking it with Mode 3. That is one of the most important issues I think that we have to raise at Bali. Another issue which is important is on trade facilitation, because as the literature also has come up that trade facilitation is one of the issues, agreement and trade facilitation is one of the issues that might be taken up quite seriously in Bali. Of course, none of the South Asian countries would oppose to it, because we know the importance of trade facilitation, the reduction of trade costs out of it, and which is important for regional as well as multilateral trade. But a trade facilitation package as a standalone agreement only will not help, because whatever you come up with, unless there is assistance mainly to the LDCs in the form of capacity building, knowledge sharing, and infrastructure development. I was emphasized on infrastructure development again. Unless that is in place, a standalone trade facilitation agreement will be no good. Hence, what we have to look into is that while supporting the passing through of the trade facilitation agreement, these other aspects are also taken into consideration. One of the things one of the positive developments within the WTO framework that we have seen recently is the provision of the extension to the LDCs for TRIPS implementation by 8 years up to 2021. I think this is a positive development. Although LDCs had asked this extension for a country to, as long as a country remains an LDC, that this exemption be provided, although that was not possible, but still what we have got until for 2021 is a positive move. But there are still other issues within the IPR regime. For example, one of the issues that South Asia country has been taking collectively for very long is making TRIPS compatible with the CBD, with the Convention on Biological Diversity, by having a disclosure requirement for patent application within TRIPS. This is something that we have been pushing forward for long, and this is something that we still have to stick to, because this is in the interest of not only South Asian countries, but all biodiversity risk countries in the world. And along with South Asian countries, there are many other developing countries which are together in this agenda, and that is where I think we have to go forward. I will not go into the details of the rest of the things. I think Professor Rahaman will also add into it. What I would just want to state over here is that, as a follow-up to what we did in Maravilla, we presented this resolution, we submitted it to our national governments in all the 5 South Asian countries and also to the SAARC Secretariat. And our expectation was that when the SAFTA Ministerial Council would be held in Colombo, which it did last week actually, we thought that although that ministerial was here, taking place to discuss issues on SAFTA, but we thought that there would be a space that our governments would set aside to discuss these issues on how South Asia as a group can go together to Bali. And we were very encouraged when we heard the Secretary of Commerce of the government of Sri Lanka, who participated in the Maravilla conference, about the positive note that he had said that he would take the initiative to take it forward. But unfortunately, as far as we have known and as far as as it has been publicized, these issues were not taken up as on a very serious basis when the ministers met. I think there is still some time, but not waiting for very long. But the South Asian countries should take it forward. They should meet again. They should make some time to meet again, at least to discuss these and maybe other different issues that South Asia collectively should take together to Bali. And as the chair said earlier, that Bali has to come out with something. Otherwise, if multilateral fails, then that's a failure of everyone. What I would like to say is that, of course, we all agree to it, and then we should all strive to ensure that the multilateralism doesn't fail, but not at the cost of what it would give to the developing countries and the LDCs. So what I think is that if Bali cannot come up with a consensus on all different things, maybe it can come up with at least an LDC package. And then South Asian countries, I think, should support that as a fallback, maybe as an alternative solution. If it's not going to come out holistically on all the issues, at least we should go on for an LDC package. That's what I think we should go to Bali together on these different issues. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Puspa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. I think Rajan has given us the broad picture, and Puspa has mentioned some of the issues which could be of importance to the LDCs. And his last point is very important, that if Bali doesn't come up with anything, then at least it should come up with an LDC package. It will save the Doha round. It will save multilateralism. So I think at least that should be the list that we should demand. Now, we have heard about the 14th summit in 2007 and the mandate that the SAARC ministers took upon themselves, and then nothing has happened in Colombo recently. And I remember that when Devopriyo was our ambassador in Geneva, we had a meeting before the MC, 7th Ministerial Conference of the SAARC ministers, and trying to get into a common position with regard to what was being discussed. But the fact remains that there are a number of issues with regard to which there are conflicts of interest, with regard to which the others there are conflicts of interest. Now, let me first of all start from the positives, that our we are 4 LDCs and 3 developing countries, and Afghanistan, of course, as we know, is in the process of accession, so 3 and 3. Now, with regard to the extension of trips to 2021, we have for the LDCs, we got the support of our developing country partners from South Asia, which was good. With regard to the services agreement, the waiver for the LDCs, there was a support from our developing country partners in South Asia, which was good. And of course, we know that, as Pradeep has mentioned, there are 3 broad issues. One is the agreement on agriculture, the other is the trade facilitation agreement, and the LDC package. And India has made it very clear that if there is no agreement on agriculture, then they will not sign trade facilitation. There are still 600 brackets undecided. So as Puspa has mentioned, whether it is an import facilitation or a trade facilitation, that has become a contentious issue because many of the developing countries are telling that without support and in terms of the commitments from the developed countries, which support they will give for trade facilitation, they will not sign it. So there are points there which are concerns both of the LDCs and also the developing countries. So there is a confluence of interest. With regard to agriculture, India, of course, is leading the fight, and whether the subsidies for the public procurement will be estimated in the aggregate measure of support, that has become an issue. What would be the reference point, whether the current high prices will be the reference point or some other prices will be the reference point, that has become an issue. And also for India, the special safeguard measures for small farmers, keeping certain items out of the agreement on agriculture, commitment of the developing country, that is an issue. So with regard to that, we don't have much of a conflict of interest, because the offensive, it is not the defensive interest. The offensive interest, the points of offensive interest, I think, are the points of contention. Then I will take the LDC package and point out some of those. The duty-free, quota-free access. Now we remember that when the duty-free, quota-free access was discussed in Hong Kong, there was no consensus amongst the South Asian countries, in spite of our best efforts. Sri Lanka and Pakistan, in fact, went against the common position of the least developed countries, and in the Annex C and D, there are items which they have requested for slower reduction of the tariff rates. So there is a conflicting interest with regard to the most fundamental issue of interest to the least developed countries, duty-free, quota-free market access. So at least in Bali, even if we have agreed in later on that there will be these items which are of interest to Sri Lanka and Pakistan, and we have agreed to that. But at least in Bali, if we don't have a predictability with regard to the phasing out of the 97% and what will be the items in the 97% of the US commitment, if we don't have any predictability or transparency, I think the LDCs will take it in a manner which will not be supportive of the multilateral trading system. So I think this is very important that we have a common position with regard to putting pressure on the US with regard to their commitment as regards 97%. The number two is Puspa has mentioned with regard to the services waiver. Now, one point which will be very important for the LDCs is whether we should, what position we'll take if there is a question of plurilateral agreement on services. Now, Puspa has rightly mentioned that we don't know which are the services, etc. I think we should be also very self-critical. We also haven't identified which are the services of interest to us. Nepal has submitted a proposal. That proposal only talks about a signaling conference and some studies. So of course we'll do the studies and identify what are the modes and sectors of services. But the fact remains that we ourselves have not identified how the LDC modalities in services will be implemented. So signaling conference, of course, we will seek support of our developing country partners from South Asia so that they come up very strongly in the signaling conference with regard to some commitments from the developed countries. But it is also important to what the commitments the developing countries in South Asia will be taking with regard to services and also with regard to the duty-free, quota-free market access. Because in the Hong Kong Declaration, it has been written that the developing countries in a position to do so will also provide duty-free, quota-free. We know that India has committed and Brazil and others have given commitments, but we would also like a predictability in terms of when they will give 100%. In SAFTA, we have received the LDCs, but in the WTO, I think that issue will also come. The other point that I was interested to mention is that outside of the WTO also, and because of the slow pace of the multilateral agreements and negotiations, there are also talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the USA is promoting as some sort of a parallel to the WTO. meaning that even if the WTO, there is no agreement in Bali, they will go along with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, what position the South Asian countries will take with regard to Trans-Pacific Partnership, which really excludes also China, and it is being envisaged also as sort of putting pressure on China. So I think that is also one important issue that we will have to take into account. So, so I would like to argue that whilst of course we think tanks we have met here, in July, and we have come up with some common positions amongst the academics, it is easier to reach consensus. But when the negotiators, they gather, and will be gathering in Bali, and we're getting the signals in the negotiations that are being carried out in Geneva. Of course, they have to weigh, and they are weighing various combinations of their points of interest. From that perspective, if the political signal doesn't go very strongly, and unfortunately it hasn't gone, then I would say that carving out a common position will be difficult, in spite of the fact that we academics, we have come up with some common positions with regard to South Asia's points of interest. But I would still argue that if the political signals are not very strong, then the points that I have mentioned of interest to the LDCs will also will be watered down, and then it will weaken the LDC positions. Countries like India, if it comes out very strongly in support, then of course it is another issue. But I see that there are fault lines, and they will have to, they will have to weigh the interests of, for example, the other developing countries, and on the other hand, the LDC interests. So I am hopeful, but I am not sure that South Asia will be able to carve out a common position when the ministers will be meeting in Bali. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think the last statement made by Mustafizur is extremely relevant for our discussions and the particularly to follow. What is quite visible is that when you talk about SAARC, then it is a microcosm of the global system. There are bound to be disagreements on several things. And the way forward is to how do we find a manner in which we can agree to disagree and work together. I think that is the lesson that is important, and as has been pointed out by both the panelists. Now, we cannot certainly, I mean, it would not be the best way forward to just have one outcome from the Bali Ministerial, unless, as the Indonesian Trade Minister said at a meeting in WTO, that we launch a Bali round and scrap the Doha round. That is something which we have spoken about in the past as well, that, I mean, this comes from various lessons from history, is that if you are not able to get something sorted out and it is sort of gets into an intractable situation, then it is better to stop it, scrap it, and start fresh. And this was at a panel at the Aid for Trade conference. I don't know whether you were there. When the Indonesian Trade Minister, with whom I was sharing a panel, said this in a manner which I thought was something worth even exploring. But going back to the discussion that we've had here, in the context of how do we create a common South Asian position and agree to be able to respect the differences of that. Now, for India, it is very important, the issue about food security. We just passed a major food security legislation in order to provide the right to food of the poorest people. And that is something which we are afraid might be challenged under the agriculture negotiations, as if it is now. As we see in the discussion so far, the US has opposed it. It's a G33 proposal. The US has opposed it. The idea is good, but not in the WTO. I mean, they're not opposing the idea as such, but to get a binding on that, one can understand why they're opposing it. The moment you tinker with the agriculture agreement, then you open up a can of worms. We are looking for a kind of a carve-out in the agriculture agreement, and then if I relate it to the LDC issue, one of the major causes of the failure of the Doha round was the issue about the cotton subsidy. And that is, it was not just the special safeguard mechanism which India and China were arguing about, but in a major sense, and this is what even Pascal Lamy shared with me personally, is the US was afraid to be able to agree to something which would then make the West Africans happy. And if you remember, this happened in Cancun as well. And we knew that there was a fig leaf of Singapore issues on the basis of which the US told the Mexican chair to call off the meeting. The whole issue was agriculture again. So if you look at this kind of conundrum, one has to be very clever in order to see how we can take a step forward. There's no point in meeting in Bali and then taking, one step forward and two steps backward. You can't have a single issue. There are three issues on which there is a likely agreement in spite of whatever is the thinking. I mean, India has felt, and I'm not defending the government of India in the sense that if you do not get A, you will not give on B. You will not give on trade facilitation. Puspa has actually said that in order for developing countries, why only LDCs, to implement the trade facilitation agreement, you require a lot of support in infrastructure development, because that is what is causing a lot of delays in the movement of goods. It's not just the infrastructure at ports, but several other things. So you will get a counter factual that there is a big aid for trade program, which is only by and large looking at helping the infrastructure in the developing world, in the LDCs in particular. And there is a separate EIF package which is ongoing. So, I mean, the point is that one has to be ready with the kind of counters which are going to come forward when you're going to put forward any particular position. This is what happens if anybody has been following the Doha development round. Somebody asked, I still remember that, what does development mean in the Doha development agenda? Capacity building was one thing which was said repeatedly by the developed world, that we are going to assist the developing world and the LDCs and build their capacities. So where are we now? Of course, a lot of money was pumped in that, and how much went back to the donor countries is another question, but that is not what we are going to speak about here. Now, the interesting part, ladies and gentlemen, is the issue about balanced and ambitious outcome, the G20 communique. Now, these two words are very critical for us to understand. Balanced and ambitious for who? And that has been the cause of the non-progress of the Doha round itself. That some members feel that it has to be balanced in our favor, and we are ambitious about it. And I mean, you may have your own ambitions, but this is where the balance lies. That unless, and this is what I said, it is quite bluntly expressed that we all know that the developed world were looking at expanding their own market access. And if you look at the kind of economic situation in a large number of developed countries, you still have a problem. That can I request the floor, and please do identify yourself. Is there a mic here? And please, I'll be happy if, Dave, you can raise a provocative question. Hello, Mike.
I have it. No, Mr. Chair, I was wondering whether you're giving your concluding speech or not.
I was trying to provoke the audience.
Okay. Now, getting ambitious that I will get a balanced outcome in terms of allocation of time. So that's why I was getting.
What is your question, sir?
My point is that I think we have a very good, interesting session, and I would like to. I'm Debapriya Bhattacharya from Center for Policy Dialogue, Dhaka. I will try to stick to the subject of today's session because you can discuss these things till the cows come home. Yes, and so let's stick to the situation, South Asian position. I guess you can take two approaches to it. One is you can look at it from the negotiating technicalities. And we can go down to specific to the deliverables and the Doha agenda in general and speak about it. Or we can take a much more strategic and systemic view about it. And since time is short, let me speak on the second part. I want to compliment both the speakers and the two discussants for putting the canvas right. I will pick only one point of contention with the keynote speaker when he says that there are three explicit groups, developing, developed, and the LDCs. I think this is a very oversimplification of a complex reality. We know the terminology, the variable geometry, which goes on in the WTO parlance, and it is never like that in that way as the things are now. There is no north-south divide as such. It's very difficult to have that north-south divide. It's also very difficult to have those triangulation or the three levels of distinction. Very concrete example, if you see that how these have moved in, you take the food issue, which you have just raised, and in the food issue, I think it is very explicit how this three division does not hold in many ways. And if you take the classical case of South Asia, here again we do have divergences. I will come to that. And also you will see in the services negotiation that has partly come. Now let me come to the very concrete point, South Asian position. Mustafizur has referred to our efforts to call the ministerial sideline meeting before the July ministerial of 2008, which was essentially a successful one, but what can you do for 1 hour just before the meeting? And since then there had been no follow-up, both in the SARC process and also over there. Now the critical question is, why it is not there? Is it just by accident? Is it because some people did not think it through enough? Or the think tanks were not effective? It is a reflection of the reality. You do not want to have a declared regional position and by way of bind yourself to certain position in which you also forego your flexibilities in the negotiations. And who exactly is the country which would like not to have those flexibilities foregone? This is something which we need to think about. Why the ministerial meetings of the trade ministers have never had anything beyond a declarative statement, a very banal statement of no potent, and nothing beyond that giving, even when they said that, they forgot to instruct their ambassadors how to act on them. And why the negotiators in the Commerce Ministry never really took it up in any discussions on that. So basically, there had never been a system which would really evolve an internally consistent negotiating agenda, both in the capital and thereafter in Geneva. So that was one missing point which we'll have to see. The second point which I would like to say, just give me a minute, sir. Just keep a balance here. The second point which you see, the explicit difference of opinion have never been tried to be sorted out. The food issue. The LDCs in particular are trying to have a more discipline, not opening up the agriculture negotiation, but more discipline about trade restriction on agricultural products. No notification, India goes on and putting it. And not to deliver even committed food aid to Bangladesh in that way. We have seen in 2008 and 2009. Now whether we do that, how we do that, and this is an issue which will separate. Services negotiation is a critical basis point. Puspa mentioned about Pakistan. One goes on really thinking what is India's position over it and China's position over it. So whether they're keeping this option open in that way. Let me conclude by putting one thing over here. What is going to happen in the coming days? I don't see much time for South Asia to put SITAC together and to do a technical work because it is based on technical work. And there is not much time, there is no effort, there is no system, there is no political guidance over there. The new thing which is coming up, as you know, our good friend Roberto has taken over yesterday, and he is something, whether how he will act in shaping the Bali meeting will be a very critical point in the coming days. And one thing is for sure, he has already distanced himself from the BRICS, and we should not have no illusion that he will be a BRICS DG. He will be a WTO DG. And that's how he will separate. But the issue is whether he will have the same amount of interest and sympathy as Pascal Lamy used to have about the LDCs and partly about South Asia will be retained or not will be a critical issue as we see in the forward. And the second point is that instead of crying over Bali, I think what is most important is that the post-Bali work program. The post-Bali work program is more important than the Bali declaration. I think this is something I wanted to emphasize. What will come out of Bali will be an amalgam of some decisions, some guidance, and some reiteration of stock taking about some of the work. So that is not much, but more importantly, it will be the post-Bali work program. If I had been you, who wants to give leadership to all this thought process, I would have focused myself on the post-Bali work program and look at it, how we can develop a South Asian position on that. Thank you.
We can have a post-Bali program only if we have a Bali deal. Nagesh.
No, I'd like to join Deb in complimenting the three speakers and you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, just wanted to touch on this TPP with Mustafizur Rahaman referred to. But there is another one. I think this is, the new trend, which is again moving back to very big transcontinental trade blocks emerging on the horizon. So TPP being across Pacific, and the other one is a Atlantic EU and North American Free Trade Agreement joining together. And the kind of high standards they are having in the mind, the template which TPP is setting up for all different issues, including the Singapore issues, investment and all that, is mind-boggling. And the fear, I think we should be concerned whether TPP kind of template would be someday imported into WTO, and we would be found, in kind of struggling to deal with it. And the other point about Doha round, yes, practically there is no life left, but I think it is in the vested interest of developing countries to preserve it and protect it, because at least it has this name development in it. And if it is abundant, what will come, to replace it would be a very, very difficult one. Thank you.
Thank you. I have been asked to conclude this session by 6:15, which is another 2 minutes, I suppose. And if you can take one sharp question at the back, then I'll go back to the panel.
Someone also wanted to speak.
We have no time, unfortunately.
Very quick. My name is David Gould. I'm with the World Bank. My wish, my aspiration is that this round moves away from kind of the mercantilist thinking that exports are good and imports are all bad. And another hope and desire is that we recognize that oftentimes trade policy is not a national policy, but it's rather the function of a lot of self-interested groups. And we have to look past these self-interested groups for protecting their own market and look at the broader benefits for the economy as a whole, and including the consumers. And one thing that I don't know if you have time to comment on is how is that being expressed in the South Asia position? The benefits, what are the benefits to the consumers?
Thank you. Thank you, sir. I'll turn to the panel. Let me start with both the discussants, and then I'll go to the keynote speaker at the end. Mustafizur.
Well, thank you, Chair. I think a number of very important
about
points were made.
a minute.
A minute, okay.
Devapriya has already taken your time here.
Okay, no. I would make 5% of your speech. When I was listening.
I have the privilege of being the chair, Deb. You come and sit here, then you do what you like.
Chair, when I was thinking about South Asian position, I was thinking about how European Union of 27 countries can take a single position. And I was thinking about the regional integration that we are all talking about. If there were regional integration, if there were value chains, if there were supply chains within South Asia, we wouldn't be concerned. Sri Lanka would have thought that if Bangladesh gets market access, I am selling fabrics to Bangladesh, what is the problem? India would have thought that I am selling yarn and cotton. Pakistan would have said that I am selling fabrics to Bangladesh, and if Bangladesh can export by taking advantage of the zero tariff, what is the problem? I am also exporting more. So our lack of regional integration, I think, is the key issue.
Mustafizur, you made an extremely vital point that our common position at Doha should include our regional integration agenda, and that is where you can get the strength to talk what you're going to say. Thank you very much.
That means
Puspa.
I can't have any more time. Thank you.
We are running against time. The hotel they need the hall for a cultural event.
It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah, no problem.
Well, Yeah, there are very good suggestions, not questions as such also, but I'll pick up on what Professor Rahaman just said. Of course, I mean, there are challenges, and that is what we have seen always for South Asia not being able to have a common position whenever we go on to these multilateral negotiations. And as Professor Rahaman rightly said, that one of the reasons is the lack of regional integration, because of which we are not being able to have a common position, as we saw in the case of duty-free quota market access. Then why can't South Asian countries go for a common position with the sense that that would ultimately also lead to the regional integration in the region? That,
you can have it even without a common position.
That could be other way around. So, of course, I mean, there are pessimism, but I think we as civil society, as non-government organizations, as think tanks, should always find a way of finding out at least some issues in which we can have a common position and then push our governments
I
to
think
have that.
that is what ministers may be able to buy.
Okay, maybe I'll take more than 1 minute, if you allow me.
Common position.
Okay.
Forget Doha round.
No, but I need to respond. I wanted to respond to their Priya also.
We can do it over a drink.
No, then he could have raised it over drink with me.
Sorry?
Okay, no. What I would suggest is what Mustafizur says, regional integration, which I also said. Please be mindful of the fact that in the agenda of the SAARC, having a custom union is already there on board.
Yeah.
It's only a matter of time. We do not know how much time it is take, because we are only talking about SAFTA Plus now, and SATIS is only a framework agreement. So what is important to become a cohesive regional group, which is missing, and that we should not lose sight of. If you become a custom union, you become like Europe, and you will have a common position, because then there will not be any threat. So if you look at a future, you become optimistic, because that is the way it is, and that is the way we are looking at it. Common position, definitely there is going to be a common position. On the LDC package, India, Pakistan and Sri Lanka have supported, so there is no question of not having that. Depriya, when you said developing, I did speak that there are other countries like Keynes Group, and Puspa said about a really good friend of services that Pakistan is there. But I'm not talking about that. If you look in the context of Bali, presently the diversified group which is not leading to conclusion of a Bali round is not because of these groups which are within the develop others. If you look at the triangle, the question is, I mean, I will be blunt, LDCs have no commitment to make in Doha, and therefore they are taking one side, looking into only, and what gentleman said, export are good, import are bad. That is what is the concept. So if I have no obligation, I am not interested in what is that brings good to you. If that is the syndrome in which we are working, then there will not be any common South Asian position. The second issue which comes into, which you have talked about post-Bali, yes, one would need to think about, but what you are not able to think in 3 months' time where you are going to be, how you are going to anticipate where you are going to be in 5 years' time frame? You need to put a serious effort if there is a common position for Bali. Can you be cohesive? If you are not cohesive, okay, we can continue to talk another 10 years for post-Bali. I mean, what's the big deal? You can continue to do that. But what is important is at this moment of time, which we missed this opportunity in August here, because now the ministers are going to meet only in Bali. From here till December, there is no SAARC ministers meeting which is going to take place. And perhaps I'm at least privileged, and I'm very happy that we are discussing this issue at such a big platform, which is a South Asian Economic Summit, which provides you a platform to discuss this issue. At least now it can go perhaps to the ministers if they see that what they have missed. That is all I can
Thank
say.
you. I wish there were more trade ministry officials in this room. Unfortunately, I don't know how many trade ministry officials are here. I can't see a single hand, and that is a tragedy. Indeed, sir, it is a mercantilist world, and that is what we need to recognize, and therefore, regional integration is also a mercantilist agenda. And that is the way I think there is a fair amount of consensus that if we have to develop a kind of common position, then we need to be able to talk better. And as Rajan reminded us, there is an agreement to have a customs union. We don't know when it will happen. The other day I was in Accra in West Africa. They have a customs union, but they still haven't agreed on a common external tariff. So they're talking about post-Bali agenda. Here I'm talking about a post-customs union agenda. Things move slowly in the developing world. With that, thank you very much. And a big hand to the panelists and the keynote speaker.